Hey, right, today's topic, the hidden costs of buying cheap Chinese and cheap Indian motorcycles. There's two sides to every coin. Now, let's just get a couple of things out of the way first. You know, there are two camps regarding Chinese and Indian motorcycles. There's the fans that think they're wonderful, great value for money, and there are then the people who, to their disadvantage, have discovered the expensive downside of owning these machines, and they leave comments on this channel all the time. It's been going on for years with the Royal Enfields, and more recently, over the last 2 or 3 years, it's been happening with the Chinese motorcycles. The content that I present in this video doesn't constitute empirical proof of anything in particular. That's not my responsibility. It's not down to me, you know, to wipe everybody's asses for them. If you're going to drop a load of cash on a motorcycle, you're interested in what the bottom line is on the purchase invoice, but it's your responsibility to look into other aspects of the cost of ownership. Most people are quite happy to convince themselves that these machines are a good, wise purchase, and generally speaking, they reinforce that idea by just, visiting echo chambers that are influencer channels here on YouTube, Facebook, wherever. But are quite happy to just tell them whatever it is they want to hear. Now, first of all, the legacy motorcycle press. Motorcycle journalism is not real investigative journalism. Again, it's just an echo chamber for manufacturers. That is all it is. Motorcycle journalists are not real journalists. They're in a codependent relationship with manufacturers. And I'll tell you now, I receive all these press releases from different manufacturers, and then the same day or the day after, I'll see this press release released by one of the big magazines, and all they present to you in that publication is word for word the exact narrative that the manufacturer has released. There'll be no fact checking, there'll be no looking into it to check if what the manufacturer said is correct. They will just parrot exactly what the manufacturer has told them to say. It's not exactly a copy and paste job, although I have seen copy and paste jobs. They will flower it up a little bit, add some words in here, rephrase things slightly to make it look like their own work. But the information is exactly the narrative that the manufacturer has given to them without any checking whatsoever. So when a manufacturer has all-time record year in sales, they won't check the facts to see when those sales were and whether those sales were genuine or whether they were just pre-registrations en masse to artificially boost it to make it look like they'd sold more bikes. They'll just churn it out and publish it as the manufacturer has told them to. Like I say, it's a codependent relationship. Without press bikes and being invited to press launches, a motorcycle magazine has nothing. They've lost the business, so they have to keep the manufacturers sweet. In return, the manufacturer sends them a plentiful supply of press bikes for them to create content or publications with, and they invite them to swanky launches where they're wined, dined, accommodated in luxury for a day or two, and often they'll hold these events in exotic places, and they'll pay the travelling expenses to get them out there. And of course, there are some unwritten rules that the assessment of their bikes must be all positive. Otherwise, the all-expenses paid trips to exotic locations dry up, and so do the press bikes. And not only that, because these press organisations don't actually buy and run these bikes, they've got no idea what the running costs are. So you've got to take everything that they say with a pinch of salt. Then we move over to the influencers. Now, this is where I fell foul of the motorcycle industry. I started this channel up basically as a guy that just loves motorcycles, wanting to share, my experience and views with everyone else, until some of the motorcycle manufacturers noticed what I was doing and started, inviting me to take press bikes, etc. Which, of course, I was more than happy to do because, it gave me more content. And to be honest, I was a little bit naive about how it all worked. Now, Chinese and Indian manufacturers both have one thing several things in common, to be quite honest. First of all, they can't really compete on technical excellence where the machines are concerned, and I'll go on to that in a moment. Also, they're not heavily into customer care, so once you've bought the bike, and you've got issues, you don't always get the sort of care and response that you expect. So what they've done is they've leaned into influencer programs very heavily. YouTube channels have been their main targets, and the reason for this is, it's the little guys like me, a guy that just works on his own. They're far more easier to manipulate than the press are. Mainly because they don't have that wider network of industry contacts, so they become far more dependent on the manufacturer. But I don't exactly fit into that category. You see, I'd already been going for a few years. I already had a lot of industry contact, not so much motorcycle manufacturers, because I always bought my own motorcycles, whether it was a Royal Enfield, a Triumph, or whatever else. I owned them outright. I'd bought and paid for them, so there was no obligation to pay back any debt to them. I'd built this channel on product reviews and general sort of care and maintenance videos, so I had all that to fall back on. So when Royal Enfield started offering me press bikes, I had no incentive whatsoever to play this silly game with them. I continued, as I always had done. I would tell you the good, but I would also tell you about the bad. And they didn't like that. I would always be diplomatic about how I presented flaws on bike, thinking that would be enough, but it wasn't enough. And it started in 2023. I didn't get emails from the marketing team at Royal Enfield. What they started doing was sending me voicemails by WhatsApp, and they were the most bizarre messages I've ever had. A very quiet, hushed, almost Al Capone type voice, stating that they'd seen my review on such and such a bike, and they'd noticed that I'd pointed out some flaws in the paintwork, or the fact that the handlebars were slightly bent or something like that. And then they would just cut dead. Now, obviously, these voicemails were intended to intimidate me in some way and pull me into land. But you see, I'm not like that. My reaction would be immediately to, send a voicemail back saying, what is this weird-ass message you've just sent me? If you've got something to say, let's talk about it on the phone. But they never rang me back. And of course, as time went on, it got harder and harder to get press bikes, and eventually Royal Enfield press bikes dried up. Now that tells me one thing: Royal Enfield cannot compete with other manufacturers on quality and engineering excellence. So what they need to do is hush up any talk of defects on the bikes. They're not prepared to try and fix the issue and take it as constructive criticism. What they want to do is just silence it. So just to reply to those comments that I get quite frequently, I didn't fall out with Royal Enfield. They fell out with me because I told the truth. Now, one of those messages was, of course, about the failed speedo on my classic 350. A known fault. It was a known fault at the time, but they didn't have any stock in the UK. It took 3 months for me to get that sorted. It's still a known fault, and it's still continuing. I'm still getting messages from people in comments saying, I've been waiting 10 months for a new speedo, Stu. In the end, I had to buy myself one from India. It cost me £30 or £40 or whatever, but I'm now back on the road. And that's the other thing about the unforeseen costs of running Indian and Chinese motorcycles. Now, there was a time when Royal Enfield motorcycles seemed, quite a good buy. They seemed cheap compared to what other bike manufacturers were doing, but that's all changed now. Exponentially, they've upped the prices each year until I think now they've reached the point where they're uncompetitive. The main reason being that the big boys from Honda and Yamaha, etc., are bringing in sort of similar sort of spec'd models at less or similar money. And with the best will in the world, Indian and Chinese manufacturers cannot compete with that. Royal Enfields are okay. but they're just okay. You know, in comparison to something like a Honda or a Yamaha for similar money, Royal Enfield are crude engineering. You know, you can tell this just by the running in procedures. It takes 1,200 miles to run a Royal Enfield in and 300 miles to run in a Honda, because the engineering tolerances just are not there with the Royal Enfields. Quality control is spotty to abysmal, and you know, it's a gamble when you buy a Royal Enfield. You don't know whether you're going to get a good one or a bad one. If you get a good one, great, you're fine, you can run it for 3 years until you get your next bike and have no problems with it. If you get a bad one, it can spend most of its life off the road while you're waiting for spares, because Royal Enfield's main marketing impetus is to produce to sell bikes, not produce to provide spare parts for bikes they've already sold that have gone wrong. Their priority is to make parts to be fitted to new bikes to sell them to make more money, not to make new parts to replace parts that have broken on people's bikes whose money they've already got. They're not really interested in that side of it. They can make all the excuses they like about, you know, trying to get the infrastructure network sorted out for the supply of spare parts for warranty claims, etc. They've been at it for years. If they haven't got that right now, they are never going to get it right. The result of that, of course, is that we've got dealerships closing down all over the country one by one. There are fewer dealerships now than there were 3 years ago in the UK and across Europe. Because the dealership has a responsibility to the customer they sold a bike to, and it was all becoming too much hassle for them. There are other reasons, but that's one of them. Chinese manufacturers have a very similar attitude to after-sales care. For a start, I mean, they've not been going quite as long as Royal Enfield in the West, but they haven't fully got the distribution network set up, and they're sort of gaining and losing dealerships all the time because of the way they do business. Now, the other reason for this with the Chinese manufacturers is that all Chinese manufacture of motorcycles is heavily subsidised by the Chinese government through grants, 0% finance, all sorts of perks and incentives to allow them to build state-of-the-art factories at a knockdown price so they can produce bikes for virtually nothing. And of course, on top of that, they can develop the machines very cheaply because they're in all sorts of collaborative technology sharing deals with companies like BMW and KTM. It's written into Chinese law that if you go to a Chinese company and get them to build components or products from you, that company gets ownership of some of that intellectual property. So they don't have to develop their own bikes, they just use other people's, quite legally, designs to build their own bike. Because of all the perks that they have, their manufacturing standards are higher than the Indian bike, so they look like an absolute bargain. But it's this intellectual property sharing thing and all the perks that causes the problem, because this allows them to stay competitive by doing complete model refreshes once a year, once every 18 months. And I mean a complete ground up redesign. And once they've done that, when a model's about a year and a half old, there's no incentive for them to continue producing parts for the older bikes that were sold the year before. So this is where the problem comes in with the supply of replacement parts for Chinese bikes. They simply stop making them after a year or so. So it depends where you are on that cycle when you buy your new bike at a knockdown price, one of the Chinese models. But as I discover every day from people, leaving comments and telling me, I've got a 7-month-old this or that. We've had electrical problems with it. The dealership can't sort it out. They can't get the spare part for it. So I've had to sell it. And I hear that every single day. Electrical problems, mechanical problems. The parts simply are not available for them. And because of that, Chinese bikes have an incredibly low second-hand resale value, because the dealerships know, well, if anything goes wrong with this and I sell it to somebody, I'm not going to be able to get the bits for it. It's a liability. If I'm going to buy it, I'll pay peanuts for it. That's just the way it is. So there's that hidden cost that you have to take into consideration with Chinese bikes. Now, the other problem with Chinese bikes is technology. These bikes are very technology oriented in order to grab the Western customers. You know, TFT screens, all sorts of electronic gizmos. Software isn't perfect. Their software certainly isn't perfect, so that the software that runs these bikes often goes wrong. Now, this requires specialist diagnostics equipment in order to find out what the problem is so that it can be rectified. And the problem is, a lot of these dealerships are fly-by-night dealerships. They appear, they think, oh, I can make a fast buck here selling these cheap Chinese bikes, but they don't invest in the diagnostics equipment or software. So when it comes to these problems occurring, there's nothing they can do to diagnose it. They don't know what's wrong with it, and if they don't know what's wrong with it, they can't fix it. From the bigger, more reputable dealerships, getting on the training courses A, to get the staff trained up to use these diagnostics, and B, to actually obtain the diagnostics equipment from the manufacturer is an ordeal in itself, and often they don't have it either, so they run into the same problems. They can't diagnose the fault, so they end up pulling bits off, putting replacement bits on to see if something works or if it doesn't work, a suck it and see sort of approach to trying to fix them. And I hear this all the time, you know, the dealerships have my bike for a month, they've replaced this, they've replaced that, they've replaced the other, they've taken this out and cleaned it and redone it and put it back in again, but the bike still won't work because they don't have the specialist diagnostic equipment or up-to-date equipment to actually be able to find out what's wrong with that bike. And because the manufacturers are changing the model every year, 18 months, even if they try, they can't keep up with the changing diagnostics software because it becomes outdated so quickly. So what you've got to contend with Chinese motorcycles is a sort of a 12 or 18 month cycle of built-in obsolescence. After that, it's hit and miss whether you're going to be able to get backup and support for it. It doesn't matter if it comes with a 3-year warranty. If your retailer, if your dealership doesn't have the ability to put it right, that warranty is worth nothing. It's just a lot of hassle. People are always jumping into the comments section on videos defending Chinese bikes and no, the wonderful machines. People said this about the Japanese back in the 1960s. This is just the same. No, it's not the same. The Japanese were driven by market forces. They wanted to sell bikes, they wanted to give good customer support, they wanted to keep those bikes on the road for as long as possible, so they got a good reputation. Chinese manufacturers are not driven by that ethos. They're driven by, you know, sell low, sell in volume, change it and sell it all again. They're not interested in aftercare for the customer. The Chinese business model is driven by directives from the Chinese government. The object is to dominate trade in the West. And in order to do that, what they do is they undercut everybody else. There is no incentive to provide good after-sales care. What they want to do is simply put everybody else out of business, so you've got no choice but to buy their bikes and put up with the problems that come with them. That is their end game. It's to sell you a product with a short lifespan, and when you can't repair it anymore, to sell you another one and just trap you in that endless cycle. That is the Chinese way of doing business. That's not what the Japanese did. Now, before we move on to Royal Enfield and servicing, just a quick word about collaborations with YouTube channels with Chinese manufacturers. I get invitations from Chinese manufacturers all the time, and let me tell you how it plays out. They offer you a fee to review their bikes. If you agree to it, just as you're about to get to the point where they're going to sort out a date with you to have the bike delivered, they send you a PDF contract to sign, and you must sign it before they go ahead. And that contract has all sorts of stipulations about, you know, how their name is to be presented in the review. It's got to have a prominent place on the title, etc. It has to be a positive review. You're not allowed to say anything negative about the bike, and before you're allowed to publish that review, you have to submit it to them for approval, and you have to make any edits or alterations to it that they stipulate. That's why I don't review Chinese bikes. So whenever you see any of these influencers that are getting a stream of Chinese bikes for review, you are not watching reviews, you are watching a 100% contractual paid promotion. It's not a review, it's an advertisement. Now, back to Royal Enfield again. Regarding BSA, I can't really comment on warranty claims with their bikes. I still think that the quality of their bikes is very similar to Royal Enfield's in a lot of ways, but I never had any warranty claims with them, and I did my own maintenance, so I never really experienced their servicing costs. But this is a big issue with Royal Enfield. Now, I've been getting comments about servicing costs of Royal Enfield right from day one, going right back to sort of 2020. A lot of people service their own bikes. That's fine. I've always serviced my own bike, and in that respect, although it's a little bit more difficult than a normal bike, you can do it quite cheaply. Where people get caught out is, they might buy a pre-registered Royal Enfield at a knockdown price, but they are going to get that money back from you if you are taking it to them for dealer servicing, because when Royal Enfield design these bikes, ease of maintenance is the last thing on their minds. Servicing is very time consuming because it's been very badly thought through. For a start, I can't comment on the liquid cooled singles, but the air cooled twin and the air cooled single both have two oil filters that need to be attended to during a service. You've got your primary oil filter, and then you've got your secondary oil filter that you see me removing here in this shot now. Now, Royal Enfield recommend that you drop the oil out of the bike for your oil change via this secondary filter for a reason, because they're completely ballsed up the sump plug, which I'll show you in a minute. Now, the reason that they have to have a secondary strainer is basically down to the very poor manufacturing practices, which basically boils down to lack of care and cleaning before the engines are assembled. There will be some sizable metal particles floating around in the oil galleries, which need to be captured somehow, and that's what this secondary strainer is for. The big problem is sealant. They use copious amounts of sealant on it. One of the features of these bikes when you get them is where all the engine cases are joined together. There are big chunks of sealant hanging off on the outside, and if they're hanging off on the outside, they're going to be hanging off on the inside as well, and eventually they're going to become dislodged. This secondary oil strainer is designed to catch those without the oil flow being blocked to the upper parts of the engine, because if the oil flow is blocked, obviously the engine is going to be starved of oil and there's going to be a problem. I don't know of any other manufacturer that has two oil strainers in an engine. This is an extra step that takes time, so when you're having your dealer servicing it for you, it's going to be added onto the bill. It's going to be more expensive than a conventional bike. The other issue is that when they design the position of the sump plug, that's why they tell you to drain the oil from the secondary strainer, they didn't take into consideration the fact that the frame of the bike was going to be in the way, so you weren't really going to be able to get access to it. The problem is, behind this sump plug is about an additional 1/4 of a litre of dirty oil that if you don't remove it and drain it from there, you're still running a sizable amount of contaminated oil in your bike, which partially defeats the object of changing your oil, doesn't it? So if a dealership is going to do the job properly, he needs to get that sump plug off and drain that remaining oil, which means even more time added on to the final bill of servicing your motorcycle. But it doesn't stop there. The tappets need yearly servicing. They need to be checked and, if necessary, adjusted. Again, Royal Enfield didn't think this through. For a start, the fuel tank has to be removed in order to get access to the rocker box cover. The problem is that there's then a load of electronics bracketry attached to the actual frame itself, which gets in the way of getting that rocker box off. So that's all got to be taken off as well. All in all, just doing the tappets, just getting access to the tappets and then replacing everything afterwards adds about an hour onto the time required to service the bike. The viewing port for establishing top dead centre is very badly positioned. It's partially obscured, so you've got to remove the whole gasket. The gaskets are badly designed, so they're very difficult to replace without having oil leaks afterwards, and this is something I hear a lot about, oil weeping from that particular point on the engine after it's had a service. All in all, this design was a complete abortion when it comes to maintenance. And the person that ends up paying for it is the customer, because it adds, I would say, an hour and a half to 2 hours onto the serving costs of the bike at your dealership. They charge an hourly rate, so that is going to add about £120 onto the service each time you have your bike serviced, purely because Royal Enfield didn't think it through. Now, over the years, I've had some real horror stories about the final bill for getting a simple service done from viewers on this channel, and it can range from anything around about £200 for a simple service up to £500. That depends entirely on your dealer and what their hourly rates are. That's about twice the cost of me getting the service done on my BMW car. So if you want to buy a discounted air-cooled Royal Enfield with the idea that you're going to get a cheap to buy, economical to run, commuter to work or whatever, especially if you're going to be doing quite high mileage, think again. These bikes are going to cost you a fortune if you're reliant on dealer servicing. Especially when you consider the short servicing intervals. Some people, I know from the comments, are having to have the servicing done 3 times a year. And in my opinion, with the crude engineering employed in the production of these motorcycles, servicing is not something you can afford to miss, especially if you're buying it as a long-term travel investment. Now, the 650 air-cooled twin, soon to become, so we believe, a 750 air-cooled twin, is even worse. Most owners are not even aware that there's a secondary oil strainer. The reason for that is, again, in the wisdom, Royal Enfield decided to hide it right up inside the engine, and to get access to it requires removal of the entire sump. Seriously, this makes the 350 looks like child's play. There are, I think, 8 bolts to remove. The entire sump plate needs to come off. Then when you've finally got access to the strainer, cleaned it and replaced it, you've got to reseal your sump, which requires a new gasket and very careful resealing. As I say, most owners are not even aware that that strainer is in there and requires attention at every oil change. You've still got the same rigmarole getting to the tappets, which require tank removal of brackets and electronics to get access. You've then got 8 valves to check and adjust, so this can be very expensive at servicing time if it's done properly. Again, I get some horrific tales of extremely high bills for what should be a very simple, straightforward service. And of course, we recently found out that Royal Enfield has changed the service intervals on the 650 twin from 6,000 miles to just over 4,500 miles. There's obviously an issue that needs addressing, so they're having to get them serviced more regularly. These can be incredibly expensive bikes if you're relying on your dealer to service it for you. Now, one of the retorts that I usually get when I broach this subject in videos is that Japanese manufacturers are even more expensive to get dealer servicing done. That's simply not true. For a start, the bikes have been designed, the engines especially, have been designed with servicing, ease of servicing in mind. So they're far simpler to work on. That means that the mechanic is going to be spending less time servicing your bike, which means the bill is going to be lower. But it gets even better than that, because most of the manufacturers now are offering prepaid deals. For the 350, £300 covers your servicing for 3 years. Now, people say no, it doesn't, because it only covers 2 full services. Well, that's 3 years, because you know you're covered for riding the bike on the road, all its service requirements, for 3 years. So it does cover you for 3 years. £299 for the 350, £600 for 3 years servicing for the 500 that I've recently bought. Now, this has been a complete breath of fresh air for me after having Royal Enfields for 7 years. They perform better, the far better quality machines. Servicing is cheaper. You know, it's not worth me getting involved with it when I'm paying that sort of money for dealer servicing. And it seems to me the only justification that people can come up with, to justify buying Royal Enfield is that they have character and the Hondas don't. Well, if character means paying through the nose because the manufacturer didn't design the engine properly, so servicing is a complete ball ache, I'll take the characterless bike every time. And it certainly seems to me from the comments that I've read over the years, your average owner that bought into the character and heritage of Royal Enfield soon gets a little bit fed up of that character and heritage when his dealer hands him a bill for £250 or £350 for a first service. And the question you've got to ask yourself is, if your dealer does do the servicing at a very reasonable price for you, is he doing all the things that he's supposed to be doing on the bike? Right, I'm not here to tell you what you should or should buy. I'm just here to give you the facts, just something to consider when you're looking at Chinese or Indian bikes and you think they're a bit of a bargain. Just take into consideration the hidden costs that might not be apparent when you're signing on the dotted line at the bottom of that sales invoice. There's often a lot more to it than you think there is expense-wise. Once again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. I really do appreciate it. I'd also appreciate it if you'd leave a like, hype this video, and subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. I will of course be back next week, so until then, please ride safely and I'll see you soon.